Welcome back to the second part of my fourth video blog. The state was originally created by a coalition of aristocracy, which provided the muscle and the power of the sword, and clergy, which provided the brains and the power of the word, i.e. moral authority. The power structures and rationalizations of which they shaped and indoctrinated into the population at large, in order to facilitate their joint control and exploitation of the rest of society, which back then was the peasantry. I'm not suggesting that they did this consciously, far from it. And the rationalizations they produced, I'm sure they sincerely believed themselves. As time passed, these two ruling elites were joined, and in more modern times increasingly displaced by numerous other and diverse interest groups, particular professions, industries, capital in general, of course, with today's lawyers, politicians and academics being largely the successors of former churchmen, each struggling for their own advantage, while believing or feigning service to the state, to the church, the people, the nation, or whatever, with the primary purpose of the state remaining the same, that is, to facilitate society's self-exploitation, mainly to the advantage of its already advantaged elites, of course, although with the rise of democracy and universal suffrage, everyone has become a client of the state and of its political elite. Paradoxically, even the disadvantaged are advantaged, not just as clients, but also thanks to their role in serving state ideology, its claim to be a nation and moral authority. So long as under the tight control of a relatively small elite, society's self-exploitation was relatively sustainable, notwithstanding its injustice and inhumanity. But not any longer. For example, individual motorization and frequent air travel, once only for the privileged few, the jet set, are now well on their way to becoming universally available to between 7 and 9 billion people, which is clearly not sustainable or even achievable, even for a short period of time on our finite and vulnerable planet. But instead of facing up to this obvious truth, our brains rationalize it, economists having made a profession of doing so that it can be ignored while we pursue our short-sighted economic self-interests and lifestyle aspirations in attempting the impossible. This was another observation which led me to recognize the perverted Darwinian nature of civilization and of the evolutionary cul-de-sac it represents, which our brains are naturally inclined to rationalize from view. Mine too. So it was quite a struggle, but one I was helped in by my own relative lack of social and professional success and status, which otherwise would probably have blinded me completely, as it does others, even such eminent evolutionary biologists as Richard Dawkins and Desmond Morris, both of whom I much admire, and whose professional expertise would surely otherwise have led them long ago to recognise what I have. This is what a human evolutionary or Darwinian perspective has to teach us about so-called society, namely that it is not a genuine society at all, which would be the modern equivalent of our original tribe or nation, but an artificial human environment, conflating and confounding the inter and extra-tribal aspects of our original environment, in which human beings are reduced to human resources, clients and consumers, which the state facilitates and regulates the self-exploitation of. The implications for understanding society and our situation can hardly be overstated. The state is like an abusive step-parent, which did away with our natural parents, our original tribes and nations, before we had any memory of them, and brought us up to believe that it was our natural, loving parent, so that it was in a perfect position to take advantage of us and abuse us. It plays us, its stepchildren, off, one against the other, while expecting, and when necessary demanding, our love and loyalty, that we identify with it as our tribe or nation. It has favourites, of course, whose love and loyalty it can be particularly sure of, the royal family being right at the top, of course, and makes a big show of caring about its most disadvantaged children, not because it really cares for them, but to maintain the deception of being a loving parent, i.e. nation. The state does serve us, of course, and we are all very much dependent on it. But as a shepherd serves his flock, which isn't primarily for the flock's sake, notwithstanding any genuine concern he might feel for a lost or injured lamb, but for his own and or his employer's sake, for the meat and wool that the flock provides and can be exchanged at market for money. The creation and development of the state was obviously essential for the rise and development of civilization, with all its positive and negative manifestations, and there can be no question of doing away with it entirely. That would create a power vacuum, which would immediately be fought over, and eventually filled, almost certainly, by something a lot worse than we have at the moment. Western democracy probably represents the most advanced development of the state, so I don't want to knock it too hard. I don't want to knock it down, since it guarantees us the freedoms we need to recognise, discuss and develop an understanding of it, of its perverted Darwinian nature, and to reform it accordingly, to change its power structures so that they serve the long-term interests and survival of society at large, instead of the narrow and short-sighted self-interest of its elites and their clients, corporate and individual, as it does now. The way to go about doing this is for us first to recognise and develop an understanding of the true, perverted Darwinian nature of the state, of civilization and of our situation within it, and then to organise ourselves, instead of leaving it to the state and capital to do for us, but peacefully, legally and grassroots democratically. This revolution will not and cannot be violent. Organise ourselves into modern equivalents of our original tribes and nations. We'll have to learn that somehow. This all sounds rather idealistic, fantastical and impractical, I know, but I'm pretty sure that this is the way we must go. I will have more to say about it in a future blog. Thank you for listening.